Have you ever been invisible to your boss? This facilities manager was completely ignored by her billionaire CEO until his son's life hung in the balance. Contrary to what most people believe, the person with the most life-saving skills in this corporate office wasn't the executive with medical insurance worth millions. It was the black woman he treated like furniture. I've analyzed hundreds of workplace discrimination stories, but this one reveals something most people never see coming. By the end of this story, you'll understand why ignoring someone's worth because of their job title or race isn't just wrong. It can be deadly, and how one emergency changed everything. Denise Williams went from being an overlooked facilities manager to the woman who saved a CEO's son when paramedics couldn't get there in time, proving that heroes don't always wear suits. If you skip this story, you'll miss the moment that shows why we should never judge someone's value by their uniform or paycheck. The 42nd floor of Carter Technologies buzzed with the kind of energy that only billion-dollar deals could generate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of downtown Seattle, while the open-concept workspace hummed with the conversations of software engineers, marketing executives, and venture capitalists who shaped the future of artificial intelligence. But for Denise Williams, the facilities manager responsible for keeping this technological temple running smoothly, the gleaming office might as well have been invisible. After 3 years of managing building operations, security protocols, and emergency procedures for Carter Technologies, she had perfected the art of moving through the corporate world like a ghost noticed only when something needed fixing. Robert Carter, the 38-year-old CEO who had built his empire by revolutionizing machine learning algorithms, embodied everything that frustrated Denise about corporate culture. He walked through the office each morning with the purposeful stride of someone who had never doubted his own importance, his expensive suits and confident demeanor commanding immediate attention from everyone in his path. Everyone except the woman who ensured his building's elevators worked flawlessly. His conference rooms were spotless for client meetings, and his security systems protected millions of dollars worth of proprietary technology. In the 3 years Denise had worked for Carter Technologies, Robert had spoken directly to her, exactly 4 times, twice to ask about office renovations, once to inquire about a broken air conditioning unit, and once to complain about contractors who had disrupted a board meeting. He had never asked her name, never acknowledged her expertise, and certainly never considered that the woman he barely noticed might possess skills that could one day save his life. What Robert didn't know was that before taking the facilities management position, Denise had spent 8 years as a paramedic with Seattle Fire Department. She'd left emergency medical services after a particularly devastating car accident involving 3 children had triggered PTSD that made it impossible for her to continue in high-stress medical situations. The transition to facilities management had been practical rather than passionate. Denise needed steady income and employer-provided health care for her teenage daughter, and corporate building management offered predictable hours and significantly less trauma than emergency medicine. But she'd maintained her EMT certification and continued taking continuing education courses, partly from professional habit and partly because old skills die hard. Robert's son Jonathan was 8 years old and suffered from severe food allergies that could trigger life-threatening anaphylactic reactions. The boy was bright, curious, and unfortunately prone to the kind of adventurous eating that terrified parents of children with multiple food sensitivities. Denise had observed Jonathan during the occasional bring your child to work days and company family events, noting the EpiPen that Robert always carried and the careful way the boy's nanny monitored his food intake. Her trained eye had also noticed something that concerned her: Jonathan's tendency to minimize his symptoms when he felt unwell, probably not wanting to worry the adults around him. During the company's annual Innovation Showcase, a catered event where Carter Technologies displayed their latest AI breakthroughs to potential investors and media representatives, Denise had approached Robert with concerns about the catering company's allergy protocols. "Mr. Carter," she'd said, clipboard in hand and wearing the professional but deferential tone she'd learned was most effective with executives, "I noticed that the catering staff isn't using separate serving utensils for different dishes, and there are several items that contain tree nuts and dairy. Given Jonathan's allergies, you might want to— I'm sure it's fine, Robert had interrupted, not even looking up from his conversation with a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley. The catering company was specifically told about his allergies. We've got everything under control. Denise had stood there for a moment, holding information that could prevent a medical emergency, and realized that her decades of medical training meant nothing to a man who saw her only as someone who managed building maintenance. She'd retreated to her position along the wall, invisible once again, but keeping a careful eye on Jonathan as he moved through the crowded reception. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was probably the most qualified person in the room to handle a medical emergency. Yet she was treated as if her only value lay in ensuring the bathrooms were clean and the Wi-Fi functioned properly. Robert Carter had built his fortune by recognizing patterns that others missed, by seeing potential in data sets that seemed unrelated, and by understanding that the most valuable insights often came from unexpected sources. But when it came to the people who worked in his own building, he suffered from the kind of willful blindness that money and privilege often created. As Denise watched Jonathan accept a cookie from a server who had just finished arranging a platter of mixed nuts, she felt the familiar surge of medical intuition that had served her well during 8 years of emergency response. Something was about to go very wrong, and the person best equipped to handle it was the same person who had just been dismissed as irrelevant. Within minutes, that dismissal would prove to be a nearly fatal mistake. Denise had learned to read medical emergencies the way other people read facial expressions, subtle changes in posture, breathing patterns, and skin color that signaled danger long before obvious symptoms appeared. Watching Jonathan move through the crowded reception, she noticed the almost imperceptible way he touched his throat and the slight flush that was spreading across his cheeks. The catered innovation showcase continued around them with the kind of animated networking that characterized successful tech events. Investors in expensive suits discussed market valuations, while software engineers demonstrated AI applications that could revolutionize industries. The buzz of success and innovation filled the air, but Denise's attention remained focused on one small boy who was beginning to show early signs of an allergic reaction. How many of us really see the people who keep our workplaces running? Denise had perfected the art of observing without being observed, moving through the corporate environment with the practiced invisibility of someone whose worth was measured by problems that didn't happen rather than achievements that did. Her background as a paramedic had trained her to assess situations quickly and thoroughly. In emergency medicine, you learn to see what others missed, the subtle signs that differentiated a minor complaint from a life-threatening crisis. Those skills hadn't disappeared when she'd traded her EMT uniform for business casual attire and a facilities management clipboard. Jonathan was 8 years old, but already carried himself with the careful awareness that came from living with severe allergies. He'd been taught to ask about ingredients to carry his EpiPen and to tell adults immediately if he felt unwell. But he was also a child at his father's important work event, surrounded by impressive adults and eager to seem mature and uncomplicated. Denise recognized the particular kind of stoicism that children with chronic medical conditions often develop: the desire to be normal, to not cause problems, to prove they could handle situations that their bodies made dangerous. She'd seen it countless times during her paramedic years, and it worried her more than obvious panic because it meant symptoms were often downplayed until they became critical. Over the past hour, she'd watched Jonathan accept treats from various servers, his careful questions about ingredients getting lost in the noise and chaos of the busy reception. The catering staff, overwhelmed by the demands of serving 200 guests while managing multiple food stations, had clearly not maintained the strict protocols necessary for preventing cross-contamination. Denise's medical training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was now screaming that Jonathan was in the early stages of anaphylaxis. The slight swelling around his eyes, the way he was clearing his throat repeatedly, and the almost imperceptible difficulty in his breathing pattern were classic early warning signs that most people would dismiss as minor discomfort. She approached Robert again, this time with more urgency in her voice, despite maintaining the professional deference that her position required. Mr. Carter, I really think Jonathan might be having an allergic reaction. His face is flushed, and he seems to be having some difficulty breathing. As someone with medical training, I'd recommend. Denise, I appreciate your concern. Robert said, his tone patient, but clearly dismissive. But Jonathan is fine. He's been managing his allergies for years, and his nanny is watching him carefully. I'm sure you have other responsibilities to attend to. The dismissal stung, but what worried Denise more was Robert's inability to see what she was seeing. Jonathan was not fine. In fact, he was approaching the critical window where allergic reactions could escalate from uncomfortable to life-threatening within minutes. Robert's nanny, Mrs. Patterson, was indeed watching Jonathan, but she was engaged in conversation with other parents and had missed the subtle changes that Denise's trained eye had detected. Mrs. Patterson was wonderful with children and had years of experience managing Jonathan's daily care, but she didn't have the medical background to recognize the early stages of anaphylaxis. Comment below if you've ever tried to share important knowledge but been dismissed because of your job title. There's something particularly frustrating about knowing you could help, but being treated as if your expertise doesn't matter isn't there. Denise retreated once again, but this time she positioned herself closer to Jonathan, abandoning any pretense of performing her facilities management duties. Her medical instincts had taken over, and she was now in emergency response mode regardless of how her behavior might be perceived by her employer. She'd spent years learning to read the progression of allergic reactions, understanding that anaphylaxis could escalate with terrifying speed. What started as mild discomfort could progress to respiratory distress, cardiac symptoms, and potentially fatal complications within minutes. The key to survival was rapid recognition and immediate treatment, but that required people to take initial symptoms seriously rather than dismissing them as minor issues. Jonathan was now tugging at his collar and had begun the kind of subtle coughing that indicated his airway was beginning to swell. To most observers, he might have seemed slightly uncomfortable from the crowded, warm reception hall. To Denise, he looked like a child whose body was launching a potentially fatal immune response. She found herself in an impossible position. Her medical training demanded immediate action, but her employment status meant she had no authority to intervene in a medical situation involving her boss's child. If she was wrong about the severity of Jonathan's symptoms, she could face termination for overstepping boundaries and creating unnecessary panic at an important company event. But if she was right, and 8 years of emergency medical experience told her Jonathan could die while adults around him failed to recognize the crisis developing before their eyes. Denise made a decision that would define both her character and her future with Carter Technologies. She approached Mrs. Patterson directly, bypassing Robert entirely. "Mrs. Patterson," she said quietly, "I'm a former paramedic, and I believe Jonathan is showing early signs of anaphylaxis. Look at the swelling around his eyes and listen to his breathing. He needs his EpiPen now, and we need to call 911 immediately." Mrs. Patterson looked at Jonathan with fresh attention, suddenly seeing what Denise had been observing for the past 20 minutes. The boy was clearly in distress, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. "Oh my God," she whispered, reaching for the emergency medication that she carried in her purse. "Jonathan, sweetheart, come here right now." But as Mrs. Patterson fumbled with the EpiPen, clearly panicked by the medical emergency developing at her employer's most important company event, Jonathan's condition deteriorated with the terrifying speed that characterized severe allergic reactions. His breathing became audibly difficult, his face was swelling visibly, and he began to sway on his feet as his blood pressure dropped in response to the massive immune reaction his body was experiencing. The room full of tech industry leaders and venture capitalists suddenly contained a child whose life hung in the balance, and the person most qualified to save him was the same woman who had been dismissed as irrelevant just minutes earlier. What happened next revealed the true difference between authority and expertise, between title and competence. As Jonathan's allergic reaction escalated from concerning to critical, the innovation showcase transformed from a celebration of a technological achievement into a medical emergency that would test every assumption about worth and capability. Jonathan collapsed. The 8-year-old boy simply crumpled to the floor of the reception hall, his breathing reduced to desperate wheezes as anaphylaxis overwhelmed his small body. The EpiPen that Mrs. Patterson had been trying to prepare scattered across the polished marble floor as she knelt beside him in panic. "Call 911, Robert shouted, his CEO composure cracking as he watched his son fighting for breath. "Someone call an ambulance." The room erupted into controlled chaos as 200 of Seattle's tech elite suddenly found themselves witnessing a child's medical crisis. Several people fumbled for phones while others backed away, unsure how to help, in a situation where money and influence meant nothing. This is the moment that changes everything. "Are you ready?" Denise didn't hesitate. Her paramedic training took over as she dropped to the floor beside Jonathan, her hands automatically moving through the assessment protocols that had been drilled into her through years of emergency response. "I've got him," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority that came from medical expertise rather than corporate hierarchy. "Everyone step back and give us room." Robert started to protest. This was his son, his emergency, his responsibility. But one look at Denise's face stopped him cold. The deferential facilities manager had disappeared, replaced by a medical professional who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Denise's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she checked Jonathan's pulse and breathing. His airway was significantly compromised. His blood pressure was dropping, and his skin was developing the mottled appearance that indicated systemic shock. "Where's the EpiPen?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. Mrs. Patterson handed her the emergency medication with shaking hands. "I don't know how to use it. I've never had to." "I do," Denise said, taking the device and quickly removing the safety cap. She'd administered epinephrine hundreds of times during her paramedic years, but never under circumstances quite like these. She positioned the auto-injector against Jonathan's thigh and pressed firmly, holding it in place for the required 10 seconds while the life-saving medication flowed into his system. The room held its collective breath as they waited to see if the intervention would be enough to reverse the potentially fatal reaction. "How far out are the paramedics?" Denise asked, maintaining pressure on Jonathan's leg while monitoring his breathing. 5 minutes? Someone called from across the room. "Maybe more with downtown traffic." 5 minutes was an eternity when a child was in anaphylactic shock. Denise knew that the EpiPen would provide temporary relief, but Jonathan needed additional medical support that only a hospital could provide. More importantly, she could see that his initial response to the epinephrine wasn't as robust as she'd hoped. "We need to get him into recovery position," she told Robert, who was kneeling beside them with tears streaming down his face. "Help me turn him on his side." Together, they carefully positioned Jonathan to ensure his airway remained clear while they waited for professional emergency services to arrive. Denise continued monitoring his vital signs, her trained fingers checking his pulse, while her eyes assessed his breathing pattern and skin color. "Is he going to be okay?" Robert whispered, his voice breaking with the kind of vulnerability that no amount of wealth could protect against. "The epinephrine will help," Denise replied, "but we need to get him to a hospital for additional treatment. Anaphylaxis can have secondary reactions even after the initial symptoms improve." As if summoned by her words, Jonathan's breathing began to ease slightly. The swelling around his eyes decreased, and his skin color started returning to normal as the medication countered his body's massive immune response. "There we go," Denise murmured, relief flooding her voice as she watched the boy's condition stabilize. "That's better, sweetheart. Just keep breathing for me." When the paramedics arrived, they found a scene that would later become legendary among Seattle's emergency medical community: a facilities manager who had just saved a billionaire's son using skills that her employer never knew she possessed. "Nice work," the lead paramedic said, as Denise briefed him on Jonathan's condition and the treatment she'd provided. "Clean administration, perfect timing. You probably saved his life." Robert Carter stood in the middle of his company's most important annual event, watching paramedics load his son onto a stretcher, and realized that the person who had just performed a miracle was the same woman he'd dismissed and ignored for 3 years. The woman whose medical expertise he'd rejected. The woman whose warnings he'd brushed aside. The woman who had just proven that heroism doesn't wear expensive suits or carry impressive job titles. As the ambulance pulled away with Jonathan safely stabilized and breathing normally, Robert turned to find Denise quietly cleaning up the medical debris from the emergency response, once again fading into the background as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed, and Robert Carter was about to learn that recognizing someone's true worth sometimes requires a crisis that strips away every assumption you've ever made about value and capability. 3 hours later, Jonathan was stable and resting comfortably in Seattle Children's Hospital. His allergic reaction fully under control, thanks to Denise's rapid intervention. The doctors confirmed what she had recognized immediately. Without the quick administration of epinephrine, the boy could have died before paramedics arrived. Robert sat beside his son's hospital bed, holding the small hand of the child, who was alive because of a woman he'd treated as invisible for 3 years. The magnitude of his blindness, his prejudice, and his near-fatal arrogance crashed over him in waves. The next morning, Robert called an all-hands company meeting. Standing before his employees in the same conference room where he'd dismissed Denise's concerns just 24 hours earlier, he told the story of how his son's life had been saved by someone whose expertise he'd never bothered to recognize. "I want to introduce you to our new Chief of Emergency Operations," he announced as Denise walked onto the stage to stunned applause. "Someone who's been keeping us safe in ways I never understood, and whose quick thinking yesterday saved the most precious thing in my world." But the transformation went deeper than a job title. Robert restructured Carter Technologies' entire approach to employee recognition, implementing programs that identified and valued skills regardless of job descriptions. Denise helped design emergency response protocols for the entire building and began training staff in basic life-saving techniques. Jonathan recovered completely and formed a special bond with the woman who had saved his life. He started calling her Dr. Denise, a title that made her smile every time, and Robert never again made the mistake of judging someone's worth by their uniform or paycheck. Which moment of recognition has meant the most to you in your career? Share your story in the comments, because everyone deserves to be seen for their true value, not just their job title. Denise Williams proved something every workplace needs to remember: the most essential skills often belong to the people we notice least. In a world quick to judge worth by salary and status, she showed us that real value lies in competence, compassion, and the courage to act when it matters most. If stories like Denise's remind you why we should never underestimate anyone, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible stories of unsung heroes doing extraordinary things. Because when we celebrate the people who work behind the scenes, we create a world where everyone's talents can shine. Until next time, remember, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work uniforms and carry the quiet confidence of people who know their worth even when others don't see it yet. If Denise's story touched your heart and you'd like to hear more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Every week I share stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things.